Picture this. It's a bitter December morning in 19 and 16-year-old Hans Müller is sitting in a bombed-out classroom in Berlin, listening to his teacher explain why they're still going to win the war. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away, American factory worker Betty Johnson is riveting her 10,000th bomber wing, working 16-hour shifts to help end that same war. Neither of them knows it yet, but they're both part of the most important conflict in human history. A war that didn't just reshape maps, but rewrote the very definition of what it means to be human. World War II. 6 years. 75 million dead. Numbers so vast they become meaningless until you realize that every single one of those statistics had a name, a face, and a story that matters even today, 80 years later. But here's what most people don't understand about this war. It wasn't just fought on battlefields. It was fought in factories and classrooms, in bomb shelters and bread lines, in the minds and hearts of ordinary people who found themselves living through history's greatest test of human resilience. The seeds of this catastrophe were planted in the ashes of the First World War. The Treaty of Versailles had humiliated Germany, demanding crushing reparations that left millions desperate and angry. Into this desperation stepped a failed artist named Adolf Hitler, promising simple answers to complex problems. By 1939, his Nazi regime had transformed Germany into a militaristic state, convinced of its own superiority. But Hitler's rise wasn't just about Germany. Across Europe and Asia, democracy was under assault from totalitarian movements that promised order through oppression. When German tanks rolled across the Polish border on September 1st, 1939, it triggered a domino effect that would consume the world. Britain and France declared war, honoring their guarantees to Poland, but their declarations couldn't save Warsaw from falling in just 5 weeks. The speed of Germany's conquest shocked everyone, including the Germans themselves. This wasn't the grinding trench warfare of World War I. This was blitzkrieg, lightning war, and it worked beyond anyone's wildest imagination. The early war years revealed a devastating pattern. Democratic nations, weakened by economic depression and war weariness, repeatedly underestimated the ruthless efficiency of totalitarian regimes. France, considered Europe's premier military power, fell in just 6 weeks in the spring of 1940. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German tank warfare, later admitted, "We were amazed by our own success. We expected months of fighting, not weeks. But conquest and victory are two different things." As German forces celebrated their stunning victories, they were also creating the conditions for their own eventual defeat. Every country they occupied became a source of resistance. Every civilian they brutalized became a potential enemy. Every resource they plundered brought them one step closer to overextension. Winston Churchill, who became British Prime Minister just as France was collapsing, understood this better than most. Even as German bombs fell on London during the Blitz, he recognized that Britain's survival depended not just on military resistance, but on convincing the world, especially America, that this was a war between civilization and barbarism. Night after night, as London burned, ordinary citizens like Norman Slater huddled in underground stations, listening to the whistle and crash of bombs. The worst part wasn't the explosions, Slater remembered decades later. It was the silence afterward, when you didn't know if your home would still be there in the morning. The character of the war changed forever on June 22, 1941, when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. This wasn't just military expansion, it was what Hitler called a war of racial extermination. German soldiers were told they were fighting subhumans who deserved no mercy. The results were catastrophic beyond imagination. In Stalingrad, a city that became synonymous with the hell of the Eastern Front, 14-year-old Albert Burkowski experienced the war as only a child could. When the bombing began, it was really horrible, he later recalled. I can still remember the planes, the noise they were making, and it became real hell. I don't know how people managed to bear it. It was all one big fire. Once we came back to his own home, there was only moaning and more moaning coming from under the ruins. My grandmother had been hiding in the basement of the house, but it was all closed in by the ruins. Everyone in there was crushed. I thought for some time that I had better be killed, because such was my grief, my misery, because I was all alone. But Stalingrad also revealed something the Nazis hadn't counted on: the capacity of ordinary people to endure unimaginable suffering rather than surrender their freedom. Soviet soldiers fought for every building, every floor, every room. The city became a moonscape of rubble and corpses, but it never fell. A Soviet soldier who survived the battle remembered. The city was a wasteland. The smell of death was everywhere. We fought house to house, street to street. It was a battle of survival. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, brought the United States fully into the war. But America's entry came with its own moral contradictions. Even as Americans fought for freedom abroad, they were imprisoning Japanese American citizens at home. Even as they condemned Nazi racism, they maintained segregated armed forces. The war against fascism was being fought by imperfect democracies, a reminder that even the most justified wars are fought by flawed human beings. The tide began to turn in Ho 42, but not in the way anyone expected. It wasn't decisive victories that changed everything. It was the gradual realization that the Axis powers had overreached themselves. Germany was fighting a three-front war it couldn't win. Japan was trying to control territory spanning half the Pacific. Both nations were discovering that conquering is easier than ruling, and that occupied populations don't stay passive forever. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 demonstrated how quickly fortunes could reverse. Japan's naval aristocracy, convinced of their own invincibility, sailed into a trap set by American codebreakers who had learned to read their most secret communications. In 4 days, Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers and much of its most experienced pilots, a blow from which it never recovered. But perhaps the war's most profound turning point wasn't military at all. It was moral. As Allied forces began liberating Nazi-occupied territory, they discovered the true scope of Hitler's final solution. The systematic murder of 6 million Jews, along with millions of other victims, revealed that this war wasn't just about territory or politics. It was about the fundamental question of whether civilization could survive in a world where industrial efficiency was applied to mass murder. Heinrich Wulfes, an SS soldier, who participated in these atrocities, later testified, "I was involved in the terrible work of the Einsatzgruppen. The executions were carried out in the most brutal manner. The screams of the victims still haunt me." These weren't the words of a monster, but of an ordinary man who had been transformed by ideology into something monstrous, a reminder that civilization is always more fragile than we want to believe. The final phase of the war, from D-Day in June 1944 to Japan's surrender in August 1945, revealed both the best and worst of human nature. American soldiers storming the beaches of Normandy showed extraordinary courage in the face of almost certain death. Soviet forces advancing toward Berlin displayed remarkable resilience after suffering losses that would have broken any other army. But the same period also saw the firebombing of Dresden, the rape of Berlin, and the atomic destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Reminders that even the most justified wars exact a moral price from everyone involved. On the Pacific Front, American soldiers faced a different kind of horror in places like Bataan, where Japanese forces marched captured Americans and Filipinos to their deaths in the tropical heat. An American survivor remembered, "The bodies were left where they lay. The Japanese guards were brutal. We were marched for days with no food or water. Many died along the way." These death marches revealed how the dehumanization of enemies inevitably leads to the dehumanization of everyone involved. When the war finally ended in August 1945, the celebrations were real but complicated. Norman Slater, the London civilian who had endured the Blitz, captured the mixed emotions. "I remember the day the war ended. We yelled our heads off. There was a deep-seated relief. No more guns, no more killings. It was a relief once the boys came home." But even as people celebrated, they were beginning to grapple with what they had lived through and what it meant for the future. The statistics of World War II are staggering. 75 million dead, entire cities destroyed, economies shattered, populations displaced. But numbers can't capture the war's true significance. This was the moment when humanity came closest to destroying itself completely, and somehow found the strength to pull back from the brink.